How many of you have ever been to Africa? Quite a few guys. We were in Kampala, Uganda, about 3 years ago on a mission trip. It was a medical mission trip to a church there, along with our missionary, Karen Hoagland. And I saw a man there that made a huge difference, Pastor Andrew. If you've been to a city in Africa, you know that it's just chaotic. There's people everywhere. There'll be a 15-story glass building over here, and then there'll be a shanty and mangy dogs wandering around right next door. Everything looks like it's broken. It's wired together. You wonder how the cities operate. The streets are open because of they're putting in a new sewer line. And we were at this church, and Pastor Andrew, a couple of times a year, does a medical clinic, and hundreds of people come. And he brings in doctors and dentists from all over the world who come and serve. He has a food distribution. He does discipleship. He's a trustworthy man. Here's a man who's making a difference in a whole city. And when I think about Pastor Andrew, I think God has His people. God has His people everywhere. I think of you. I say this all the time. I think of you, where you work, the family you're in, the networks you have, the neighborhood you live in. God has you. God has me as His person in that context. A man can make a huge difference in the way you view a company. AutoZone used to be a car parts place. It's now been bought out by somebody else, and there used to be a guy at the Apple Valley AutoZone, and I would want to go when Mark was working. Because Mark, first of all, he knew me by name, and he was so creative and so helpful. When I was trying to get parts for my old Volvo, he would find a way to do it. And I knew he wasn't making any money helping me, but Mark made a difference in my life. I remember an incident here at Berean with one of our men. He was called late on a Saturday night by his former sister-in-law. This woman was divorced from his brother, but she still trusted Mike. So late on a Saturday night, she called Mike. She was out of town. She said, I hear there's a party going on at my house with my teenagers. Would you go over and figure that out? He got a buddy. They went over, collected all the keys of all the kids who were in the house because they'd been drinking. And then they started driving them home one by one. He took care of the problem. A man can make a huge difference. And you can make that difference. But it's not going to come with a soundtrack. You know, the Blue Angels won't fly over with a banner with your name on it. It usually comes without applause. But it's because of the character of a Christ follower. In the excellence that you give to your work, in the way that you meet people, in the way that you speak truth. That's what this series is all about, and we're looking at some ways of doing that. And today we want to talk about a huge subject, which is justice. So a man who exercises justice in his own little niche and world represents God and makes a huge difference. Well, this is a huge subject. We want to jump into it. Last week we had an interview, and the interview introduced us to some disquieting, some uncomfortable perspectives about one person's experience in the world. And she happens to be a black lady, and what she's experienced in the world. And some of those things we want to talk about some more. We won't do that this morning, but I want to come back today, not to correct her. We want to base that on her experience. And I want to just give us a biblical grounding in some issues of justice. What is it to fight for justice in our culture? What is it to be a man who is just? So let's launch today in Psalm 89:19. It says, "Righteousness and justice are the foundations of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you." The four words used for justice in the Old Testament, and actually in the whole Bible, the four words are used 1,060 times. So it's a pretty important word. And remember that justice is what gave us an eternal inheritance. Because God did not bypass sin. He did not bypass the offense and the vandalism of my life and just say, you know what, let's just let him slip in. No, he paid for it. His justice is satisfied in the sacrifice of Jesus. We call that the atonement. The substitutionary atonement. And if God's justice were not satisfied, his mercy couldn't flow to us. So that's the big arch over all of this is God's own justice. But how do we filter what we're hearing and seeing in our culture? So let's just lay a little track down. First of all, justice flows from the heart of God. And biblical justice is making individuals and communities and really the whole cosmos whole again. And there are two key elements in this view of justice, and that is that God is good and that God is impartial. And that's what our justice should seek toward, is goodness, which makes people whole, but it's impartial. It doesn't take bribes. It doesn't look the other way. And so God's heart and character is all about justice. The Ten Commandments is God's moral law. It's the foundation upon which everything is built. And then there are 613 case laws in the Old Testament dealing with everything from pregnant women to ox in a ditch. You know, there's all kinds of laws in the Old Testament dealing to walk out the Ten Commandments. But there's a balance and a tension in justice. And we're feeling this in our culture. The first side of the balance is we talk a lot about personal transformation. That my heart needs to change toward persons and people groups. I need to have a whole different mentality because of Christ. So I want to read a passage to you out of Ephesians chapter 2, which is the key passage. And as I read this, remember Paul is writing to a Gentile church in Ephesus, and there was no hatred, no racism that was more virulent than the racism against between Jew and Gentile in the first century. And so now he's writing to a church that is composed of Jews and Gentiles. So here's what he says. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off, that's the Gentiles, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in the place of two, so making peace. I was raised in a Christian home, in a pastor's home. And our routine was that every Sunday after church, we would leave for church with the pressure cooker going. You know what a pressure cooker is? You guys are old enough. It was cooking a pot roast. It was a pot roast enough for like 10 people. And because when we went to church, my mom or my dad would always invite somebody over after church. And if there was a missionary in the house, we always had that missionary and his family over to our home. So we constantly had people in our home from Argentina, from Uganda, from the Congo, from France. We had people of different nationalities. We had international students from the Colorado School of Mines at our table. So I just grew up in an environment of fascination with cultures. And I'm very thankful for that. I didn't understand it very well because I lived in a little town west of Denver that, other than those international students, was just a white culture. And but I appreciated that, and I just kind of absorbed in my spiritual DNA that all of these people are brothers and sisters in Christ. and to be loved and to be admired. And my parents modeled that for me. They modeled it by asking questions, by listening to people, by drawing them out. But that's the kind of transformation that has to happen in us, that individually I need to practice as much as I can a lack of bias or prejudice or racism toward anybody in my life. And I know many of us have been insisting, in light of the blast called white privilege coming at us, we've been saying, well wait a minute, I don't think I'm a racist. I'm trying my best not to be. Tell me where I'm guilty here. So a lot of us have had that reaction in us. And I think that's an important reaction, because personal transformation is part of God's plan for us. But then there's another side of the balance, and that is that structures and systems also need to be just. And we're not always as alert to that. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples. Jesus says in Matthew 23, verse 23, he's writing to the Pharisees, whom we really do love to hate, right? But they were the conservatives of their day. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin." In other words, they tithe down to the elements of their gardens, the spices in their gardens. They made sure they tithe that. That was their personal commitment. He says, you tithe all of that and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. You ought to have done these you ought to have done without neglecting others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. What a great analogy. I wish I'd have thought of that, Dave. But so there's personal transformation, but there are also systems that we need to do the best we can to infiltrate those systems and bring justice to those systems. James chapter 2, I'm sure you well remember this from a couple of months ago, right? Do not show partiality toward a class of people. And I think that can be generalized toward a race of people. Don't ask one person, hey, come over here and sit beside me, or take the head of the table, and to another person push them out into the foyer. Because it says we are not to show partiality, but we are to live out the royal law, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. So generally speaking, in my experience, evangelicals have weighted our transformation toward the personal side, toward salvation, toward sanctification, and that's all well and good, toward transforming the heart and holiness. But in my experience, we've tended to be bystanders and even deniers when it comes to systems and structures where oppressed people are still being oppressed. Now, that's not labeling our whole culture racist. I'm reticent to do that. I don't believe that's true. I do believe, however, that there are systems that are unjust to a lot of us, and specifically to some classes of people. So, in the 60s, my church, my seminary, was basically a bystander in the whole civil rights movement. That was a bunch of liberals marching on Selma. There weren't too many conservatives involved in that. We haven't been very involved in things like voting rights and even the environment. I'm not talking here about the Green New Deal. I'm just talking about being good conservationists. But we do have some good examples in our history. We are very proactive in pro-life things, protecting the unborn. We're against human trafficking and providing orphanages, building hospitals. We've been active about hunger and disaster relief. We've been very proactive about marriage and family. So there are structures, they don't make the news, where I think I would defend evangelicals and say, wait a minute, there are structures we have been very influential about, and we continue to do that. Well, let me get on to the main subject of the day, which is social justice. Social justice is often not what we think it is. God commands us to bring justice to society. So obviously it's therefore social. And here's what it says in Jeremiah 22. Do justice and righteousness and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed. So injustice has been going on for a long time. You know, ever since Cain slew Abel, there's been a need for justice in the world. In Isaiah 61, Jesus talks about bringing liberty for the oppressed and good news for the captives and releasing those who are held captive. And in church history, the living church has stepped up to do justice. When Rome was going through the plagues, the Black Plague, it was Christians who rushed in to care for people. They sacrificed their lives. They risked their lives to give care to people. Remember, Wilberforce fought for 40 years in the Parliament to abolish slavery. The abolitionists in our country were against slavery from the early 1800s. It took them over 60 years to get slaves liberated in our country. There was the Underground Railroad, primarily Christian people who were doing that to liberate slaves. Think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was defending orthodoxy and Christianity in the Third Reich. And by the way, Bonhoeffer said this about working in society for justice. He gave 3 steps. He said, when we as Christians see something in society that we question, first of all, we ought to question the state. Secondly, we have to aid the victims of those policies. And by that, he was pointing out the Jews. And thirdly, often we need to put a stick in the spokes of the wheel. In other words, do some resistance. And he was much questioned about his involvement, his distant involvement, but nevertheless his involvement in the planned assassination of Hitler. But the church has stepped up, but the church has missed some opportunities, and therefore it's reasonable that many people in our culture look at the church and say, you're as guilty as everybody else. Your history is tainted. Just think about some things. The evangelical church, the Lutheran church, and the Catholic church in Germany compromised with the Nazis and saw 6 million people incinerated. Apartheid in South Africa was defended by the church. They had a whole theology. Our southern states had a whole theology about slavery that defended slavery. The Native American schools and orphanages and churches that were often planted were incredibly abusive to Native American peoples. You talk to Native Americans, you look at Native American history, and you look at how children were taken from their parents and put in Christian schools. And it's abominable. Going back, the Crusades, the hiding of abuses in the church. So we have to recognize we have some vulnerability to be criticized. But let's move forward, because what we want to do is to say, there is justice. We can make justice today. So, all who call for justice will not necessarily achieve that justice. And let me give you a quick example from Marxism, which is infiltrating much of what I'm going to call social justice. A biblical worldview built orphanages and hospitals to help the marginalized and the helpless. Marxism gave us the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge. The gospel led to abolishing the human dumps of the Roman Empire, and Marxism led to the systematic termination of society's unwanted people. Biblical Christianity set slaves free, and Marxism sent millions to the gulags. You can look at this contrast through history. So despite the blights that we've seen and the lack of justice in parts of our own Christian history, the arc of this history moves toward God's justice, and we are in this generation responsible to work toward that. So here's some words that we're hearing thrown around that have justice at their core, or they say they have them at their core. Critical race theory, Postmodern deconstructionism. So if you need some multisyllabic words today to throw around, there's one. Postmodern deconstructionism. Queer theory and gender theory. We could go on and on and on about philosophies that are being brought forth that say, this is how we ought to fight for justice. But everybody talking about justice ain't going there. So let me give you some reasons for that. I'm going to lump all of this into what I'm calling social justice with quotes. Because there is a good side of social justice. I mean, we need to do good in society. But I'm going to just lump all of these other adjectives into this one word, social justice. Let me give you 3 ways that it doesn't bring about justice. Number 1, social justice blames all evil on external systems of oppression. So the reason you got arrested for shoplifting is not because of your personal irresponsibility. It's because the system is against you. And that is always, for all of us, that's a convenient dodge for the lack of accountability. Now, what this ignores is the huge rock in the road, the elephant in the room, which is individual personal sin. Romans 3:23. For all are pretty good people and worthy of a place in heaven. No. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The depth of human depravity is ignored. My depravity. No matter where I am on the scale of sanctification, sin still leaks out. And so if I blame everything on a system and I fail to look at humanity as a whole and say every single person in the system is infected with the flesh and selfishness, brutality, vengeance, bad reactions, if I fail to see that in a biblical worldview and see only the system, then the fantasy is, if I fix the system, everything will run in harmony. And that's the great delusion. And activism will never change the world. It will only bring about one revolution after another, after another, after another, and the carnage that causes. A second reason. Social justice deconstructs all relationships into power terms. It's all about power. It's not about influence, it's about power. And so all of these structures need to be abolished in the name of equality. But actually they're not abolished. What they're really talking about is taking those who are in power, whatever race or class or regime that might be, it's taking that power and giving it to the oppressed. So it's basically just a transfer of that power. A biblical worldview absolutely opposes the abuse of power. And we don't have to go very far in our city, our county, our state, our nation to see abuses of power. They are everywhere, and we should stand against those. And sometimes to stand against that means you sacrifice your position. You take a risk. You speak to that power. You stand up for justice, and you may get squashed. So we are absolutely against the abuse of power, but there are some hierarchies that are so healthy that we can't live without them, like parent and child. In our culture, that's being called a power structure. And children are now being elevated to the level of parents in terms of making decisions. Or even more than that, society will be elevated over the top of parents to take care of the children. That the village will take care of them, not you as a parent. There's the rabbi, disciple, there's the elder and the congregation, there's the teacher and the student relationship. And if these are always viewed in terms of abusive power structures, then we have chaos. And we're a nation of laws, supposedly, and those laws therefore require law enforcement, police. They require courts. And these are necessary. We've got to have power. The fact that power is misused doesn't mean we can do without power. So that's the second flaw in the social justice regime. The third one is this. Social justice interprets all truth, reason, and logic as constructs of the oppressive class. Do you get that? In other words, it's like this. You people with white privilege, let's just be blunt about it. You have invented, it's a construct of your culture that hard work and marriage is going to get you ahead. But that's just a construct of your culture. That's just something that you have imposed on everybody else. It's not really true in fact. And I'm probably using a bad example here, but what this does is it encourages someone to dismiss another person's point of view because it's not your lived experience. That's a construct from your life. That works for you, but this is what works for me, so get out of my way. So, in other words, everything is relativistic. Everything is relative. But the Great Commandment calls people from every ethnicity and every background and every class to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it also lays down, this God also lays down a reasonable, logical, moral universe that says this is the way things work. And if we throw out logic, if we throw out empiricism, if we throw out reason, we are headed for chaos. And so for those reasons, I wanted you to kind of hear what you're hearing. It doesn't solve it, but you're hearing it in interviews, you're hearing it on the street, you're hearing it everywhere about social justice. Well, what about discipleship? Let me cover some things real quickly about how character gets changed in light of this. Number one is this. Social justice encourages indignation toward people. It's a major motivator. What we need to do is get angry. Be careful, little Christian, how you're motivated. Social justice encourages this as a major motivator, but a biblical worldview says, let's overcome evil with good. Yeah, with good. Not with burn it down, but with good. We need to love our enemies. Oh, talk about personal transformation. After watching a little bit of the debate on Wednesday night, how do we love the person who opposes us? That's a constant thing. And we need to pray for those who persecute us. So that's a sea change in how do we disciple people. Secondly, social justice breaks people into group identities. And therefore it generates suspicion, hostility, fear, labeling, and a preoccupation with how somebody is persecuting me. So if you're just your group identity, then everything about that identity has to change about you. A biblical worldview instead fosters a unifying kind of love. In Ephesians 2, I read that to you. It's a kind of love that is not easily offended. It's not prickly. It's not waiting to be offended so we can go burn something else down. But it's filled with the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, and peace, kindness, gentleness, all those things. That doesn't mean it turns us into wimps. It means that with our authority and power and influence, we walk in a completely different way. A third contrast in discipleship is that social justice seeks behavior modification. And it does that through intimidation, through speech codes, through thought police, and re-education. And if you cross the line, you are punished. And so in this way, it becomes totalitarian. Totalitarian is a word that says we want to control everything about you. So it goes from behavior to even what you think. And so we see that in the cancel culture. If you think something that's not the party line, or you think something that goes against the justice quotient of Google or Facebook, then you're erased. And it can be worse than that. You can be actually punished for things that happen. We believe that in a biblical worldview that we are to persuade, that the work of the Holy Spirit needs to change our hearts. We need to disciple with truth and love and grace, and watch God work over time and never get weary in doing good in this way. So it's not a snap decision. It isn't who we elect. It's not what happens in the city hall. It's what happens in the hearts of people. So let me just conclude by saying this. Let's make this very personal, because how do we perpetuate misunderstanding? When we need to have the conversation. We need to hear things that are disquieting to us. We need to have things that are revealed to us that we don't like, that reflect badly on our culture or on our person. But how do we prevent the perpetuation of this misunderstanding and tension? So I'll give you 5 things. Number 1 is not listening.
What?
Huh? Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to become angry, James 1. So not listening is primary. Number 2 is personalizing policies and issues. This is one of the worst things that's happened in American culture in the last 20 years. It used to be the administration or the office that issued something, but now it's all become personalized in the president. And most of the time the president has no idea what happened in the Environmental Protection Agency that day. But it's as if he came and personally tweaked that particular legislation. And we've personalized policies. Governor Walz does this, the mayor does that, instead of looking at the policies. And that makes us easily offended. If we don't like the person, we can't see any good in anything he or she has ever done. Thirdly, it's relying on anger as a primary motivator. Because man, when I'm mad, I'm ready to move. And we get people mad, they'll march. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have righteous anger, but love is supposed to be our major motivator to overcome evil with good. And we've got to constantly check ourselves. How much is my anger become a primary motivator instead of something that attaches itself to a higher goal? Fourth is motive assignment. And that is that when somebody does something, I know exactly why they did this. I'm a mind reader. I know what their motive is. I won't take anything at face value. It's always got a sinister motive behind it. And Jesus said, you do not know the hearts of people. So you have to assess based on words and behaviors, not on motives. And if you listen to much talk radio, that's all this is about. We know why they did this. They're going here. Now there may be some trajectory there, but there's a lot of motive assignment in that. And finally, it's limited information, where we rely on anecdotes instead of a larger frame of reference. We take 2 points that make a line and we say, I know exactly where this is going. And we don't look at some statistics, some empiricism, a larger frame of reference. We don't listen to people from the other side. We just have limited information. Well, all of this is about the things you've seen on the streets, the things you've seen in the news, the interview we had last week, and some other things. And so I want to stir you up this morning to talk about justice and talk around your table. So I've got 3 questions for you. I hope you'll get to the third one. Maybe you should start there to look at ourselves in this whole thing. So let's talk around our tables and enlighten one another on how we can be that man. How can you be that man that God has in his place, working for justice? So blessings, guys. Talk with one another.